at the heart of how we think about Europe, how the European project thought about itself, it's probably clear now that some aspects of the way in which the European project framed itself were probably naive in relation to ideas of both. There was certainly a tendency at some levels of the Union to think about a European identity as superseding and transcending national identities. And that Europe itself would ultimately become the entity to which we all felt our primary sense of belonging was attached to. That was probably never a realistic way of thinking about how people belong, how they see themselves. Which is not to say that it is not itself worthy of significant aspiration. But Brexit has forced us, I think, to think about belonging, to think about how people define themselves in challenging ways. And it's not, I think, accidental that Ireland, which has had to develop out of very painful circumstances rather more sophisticated ideas of what it is to belong, is at the heart of the Brexit process, where that kind of complexity has not been evident. Sigmund Freud talked about the return of the repressed, and in one way you could think about the current dilemma of Brexit as the return of two repressed things. One of those was the repression of Ireland in the entire debate about Brexit in 2016. Those of us who are Irish and who care about this place tend to think it's the centre of the world. Well, it's not even the centre of these islands. And if we were ever in any doubt about the fact that Ireland is marginal to the consciousness of what might be called the British establishment, then the 2016 really told us very clearly just how marginal it was. I don't know if you remember the last big set-piece debate, the Wembley debate, televised 3-hour debate. Probably was important for a lot of people. Just before the actual vote, and I remember watching the debate and 2 hours in, thinking, when is somebody going to raise the Irish question? And eventually Francis O'Grady, the head of the TEC, who I assume from her name has some Irish ancestry, made a very eloquent and passionate plea to think about Northern Ireland, think about the consequences of Brexit for the people. And it was a very powerful moment, and you thought, okay, now finally, we're going to get some real engagement with this. And Boris Johnson was the person on the other side to reply to what Francis O'Grady had said. And he started talking about the Balkans. I kid you not, it's actually almost worth looking at. He started talking about the EU's failures in the Balkans and refused to say the word Ireland. So he would not acknowledge that the question existed at all. And of course, we're still stuck with this. We're still stuck with the fact it's not an issue. It's a false question. It's being raised for nefarious purposes by reminders. Ireland does not exist, it should not exist in relation to Brexit. But of course it does, and we know why it does, and we know what the consequences of that willful ignorance might be. But there's a second act of repression, of which I suppose I'm as guilty myself as anybody else, and it's the repression of something of another nationality, another identity, which is Englishness. If we'd been speaking here 5 years ago, and we'd been talking about, okay, let's think about the future of these islands. Think about the future of the United Kingdom, think about relations between Ireland and the UK. which of course were then, I mean, 5 years ago we would have said those relationships were better than they had ever been in the entire period of recorded history. We had never had a period in which those relationships seemed reasonably settled, and we would have said on the horizon, over the long term, you would be thinking about the possible breakup of the United Kingdom because of the possibility of United Ireland, the possibility of Scottish independence. What you would not have been talking about, what I would not have been talking about, maybe you would have a lot more foresight than I had, but I would not have been talking about the fact that the breakup of the United Kingdom, if it is to come, will be driven by another nationalism which none of us would talk about, which is English nationalism. The assumption was always that England would remain the centre around which the Union would either hold or break apart, but that England itself would be the centripetal force rather than the centrifugal force. And that was entirely wrong and entirely misplaced. And there's no real excuse for it. I'm writing a short book about Englishness and Brexit at the moment, so it's been on my mind, and I've been doing quite a bit of research on it. It's very striking that all the evidence was there. If you go back to maybe the last 10 years, it's been, in fact, very obvious that the most dramatic force in terms of identity emerging on these islands was in England. It was not even Scottish nationalism, it was not Irish nationalism, it was certainly not Welsh nationalism. And what was happening was a withdrawal of an English sense of belonging from two concepts in which it had been wrapped. There's nothing at all surprising and nothing at all necessarily to be sniffed at in English nationalism. We all have our nationalisms, we all have our sense of national belonging. We define them in very different ways, in radically different ways. And I'll come back to that. But the primary sense of belonging to a nation is normal. And historically, you could argue that the first functioning nation state is England. It really emerges in the 14th century as a pretty well-functioning nation state with a single language, for example, which, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, none of the major European countries has. With a single ruling class, with a single set of laws, and with a pretty effective central government. And of course, it becomes a very aggressive, very self-conscious nationalism pretty early on in the 100 Years' War. And therefore, there's nothing surprising about the existence of this national identity. What happened to it is, of course, that it never went away. It faked its own death. And it did so by folding itself into two other constructs. There's no great originality in saying what those constructs were. Two related constructs, obviously. One of which was empire, and the other of which was Great Britain. Related in the sense that in order to construct a global empire, it was necessary for England, rather, to have peace on its own island, and ideally on its own archipelago, as it would have seen it, including us in that equation. But particularly on its own island, Scotland was always the treacherous backdoor through which France, particularly, would literally enter English space. And so the construction of Great Britain was a kind of prelude and precondition for the construction of the empire. And it was, broadly speaking, worth it for Englishness to be buried in these two other constructs. Not least because, of course, Englishness was the dominant component of both. So the effort involved in not articulating English nationalism was not that difficult when global empire was the reward for it. Now, again, it's not giving you any news to say that both of those constructs are deep trouble. Well, one of them is over. The Empire, arguably the last gasp, largely symbolic of the imperial ideal, was in 1982 with the Falkland War. Interesting how some of the Brexiteers in the paper, they decided not to publish the extreme Brexiteers were hoping to use Brexit to launch a new task force to the Falklands. But, we know Empire is over. And we know too that the UK, although it's by no means over, the underlying evidence is that Britishness is essentially finished. This may seem like an extraordinary, wild statement to make, but look at the survey evidence. So there were two major surveys done in 2012 and 2013, and there was the census in 2011. And what they tell us, those sort of three, the census of course being the most obvious one, is that asked about their identity, 60% of people in England said that their primary identity was English, not British. And the detailed survey evidence on this is really fascinating as well, when there are more questions asked. 2013 Future of England survey, do you accept the current arrangements for the governance in England, whereby England is governed by Parliament in Westminster? What proportion of people in England said they accepted the most basic status quo? This is the most basic democratic question: who makes your laws? 24%. 24% said we accept the status quo. The rest are divided between we want an English Parliament, we want Westminster, where an arrangement in Westminster whereby only English MPs make laws for England, or we want regional parliaments in Yorkshire and Lancashire. But only a quarter of English people were saying that they were happy with how they were governed, how England itself as a political community, how its laws were made. And these are very, very radical changes. These did not exist if you look at surveys in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, nothing like this. Right? It's a very recent, dramatic shift. And of course, it's explicable quite easily by the move towards Scottish independence, the greater powers of the Scottish Parliament, the sense of resentment which arises out of that, which is like, the Scots are pulling out of this deal, but why can't England have its own independence movement? Why can it not express itself in national terms? It's important to say that there's nothing innately disreputable about this. I mean, throughout history, people have expressed their collective sense of belonging in all sorts of ways, and it's a reasonable thing for a people, if they perceive themselves to be a people, to say we want to make our own laws. It's not nothing very radically different about it. The problem with this English nationalism is that it was A, poorly articulated, and B, utterly incoherent. And I say this without schadenfreude. This is not, saying, well, there's an element of schadenfreude, but we try to keep it under control. It's poorly articulated because you have 75% of people in England saying, we don't like the way our laws are made. You have 60% of people in England saying, our primary identity is English. You have, by the way, as a result of this, there is no single part of the United Kingdom in which Britishness is the primary identity of the population. Of even a plurality of the population, never mind a majority. Not in Wales. The majority of people in Wales, in census and in surveys, say their primary identity is Welsh. In England, they say their primary identity is English. In Scotland, they say their primary identity is Scottish. The only place where there is a plurality of Britishness. There's a plurality, not a majority, but where, you know, a plurality in the sense of the largest single number of people choosing Britishness is Northern Ireland, one of our great. However, by and large, both media and political establishments were ignoring this seismic shift. This deeper sense of unease and desire to have a sense of belonging, which was expressed. No political party, except for the fringe neo-Nazi parties on the far right, took it up. The English Defence League or groups like that. Where it's tied up with white supremacy, where it's tied up with essentially fascism, and therefore, you know, respectable people don't want to go here. And so its only expression was in waving the flag of St. George at football games. And even that, if you remember, for example, Emily Thornberry, who's still a rising star of the Labour Party, who may well be the next leader of the Labour Party, got into big trouble in 2012 when she tweeted a photograph of somebody with a flag of St. George, you know, hanging from their apartment during, I think it was during the World Cup. Euro. Excuse me, Mike. And she made a kind of slightly sneering comment on this and got kind of trouble about it. But, you know, what, when you know, if an Irish politician sneered at somebody for having an Irish flag flying from balcony during the World Cup, you're like, well, no, come on, give people a break. It's not that bad. But in England, there was this sort of lack of respectability around the expression of nationalism. And partly because of this, then it's also completely incoherent. So, Irish nationalism, it has a lot of things wrong with it, but it was never inarticulate. You know, it had W.B. Yeats, it had Lady Gregory, it had Charles Stewart Parnell, it had, you know, incredibly long, sophisticated, evolved traditions of self-expression, which were both political and artistic and English nationalism is not like that, right? So it doesn't have that kind of articulation, and therefore it's completely incoherent, and this is partly why we're stuck with it. It's incoherent in the most fundamental sense. It wants to be two different things at the same time. So, broadly speaking, nationalisms, when they become politicized, some nationalisms are not politicized, like, you know, a lot of people, the nationalism is just there, so it's not something you have to worry about most of the time. But when it is politicized, it tends to articulate itself in one of two ways. I mean, one is imperial nationalism, which is we are greatest and therefore by right rule the world, we are superior civilization. And the other is anti-imperial nationalism, which is people who are subject to that and say we don't actually want you to be willing to send more, we want to have our own ability to make our own laws since we live in this kind of country. We know all about both of these things pretty close. We've experienced both of them. And each of them has a kind of power, right? It has a political power. It may be ugly, it may be destructive, it may be domineering, it may become chauvinistic, but it has a power. It functions politically. It mobilizes power. The problem with internationalism is it wants to be both of these things at the same time. So it's full of imperial nostalgia. It's full of an idea that somehow there can be a recouping of empire. In particular of the White Empire. You know, the empire without the awkwardness. Going back to the kind of trading mercantilist empire of the 18th century and the early 19th century. You know, maybe the United States with special rate of the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. So it has that sort of elements of imperial nostalgia, but imperial nostalgia doesn't work because it doesn't mobilize everybody anymore. Like, you're not going to win a vote on imperial nostalgia. The only form of nationalism that actually mobilizes people is the anti-imperial economy, which is those bastards are oppressing us and we're going to get that. It's a powerful, visceral appeal. We know all that. The problem then, you know, again, the English are just as much entitled to this as we are, except for the simple problem: there are no bastards. There is no oppressing power. If if you want to mobilize an anti-imperial nationalism, you need an imperialist. And therefore you have the need to invent the oppressor. And what we've seen in Brexit is, I think, a unique historical phenomenon. I can't think of a parallel for it where a mature democracy has invented a sense of oppression, has created a culture of self-pity, has adopted in many ways all the stances of colonized country, an invaded country, a country which is being oppressed, and then needs to have its revolution, have its nationalist revolution, throw off the oppressor. And the problem then, of course, is that you have to think, well, how are they oppressing us? What exactly is the source of this oppression? Where does it lie? And of course, it's therefore a unique phenomenon which is mobilizing all of the passion of nationalism around fictional oppression. So I cannot think of another example. And this is why it's such an incoherent project. This is why it's a project which is actually, in many ways, incapable of saying what it wants. In many ways, what it wants, if the heart of it, if you map the areas in which people in the 2011 census said that they were English and not British, they're the areas of both Brexit. In many ways, Brexit is a displaced expression of a national identity and sense of belonging, which has not had any other expression. It could have been given lots of other expressions. There are lots of civic, decent, creative ways of giving people a sense of power and a sense of belonging. Doing democracy. Why not have local assemblies in Yorkshire, for example? Yorkshire is a very strong local identity. Why not give people a sense of pride in the English democratic traditions, the English traditions of progressive thought, the English traditions of egalitarianism, the English traditions of social democracy? And one of the tragedies is that, in fact, when there was a glimpse of this, and it was kind of done in the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympics, people responded to it in very positive ways. The NHS, that's a sense of belonging and identity. That's real. That's something to be really proud of, to hold on to. But of course, a Tory government which is bent on privatising the NHS and undermining the NHS can't really make that kind of appeal. There was no centre around which a positive, progressive, egalitarian sense of Englishness could gather. And so you've had this kind of displacement. And we're stuck with it. However, the great irony of this is that we've had, in the course of this, a reversal of historical relationship. So the historical relationship between English nationalism and Irish nationalism has always been that English nationalism has been stable because it was wrapped up in these other entities, and Irish nationalism was no problem. So there was an Irish question, there was not an English question. England had an Irish question, and now we have an English question. And we have an English question not just because of all of the very practical, immediate chaos that Brexit can unleash with this island, both the north and south, but in a more fundamental way. We were very imperfectly, in very qualified ways, and with a long way to go, but we were and have been arriving at a different sense of belonging. A sense of belonging which I think has really quite something to say to the European project. Why? Because we've been arriving at a sense of belonging which is not about naively thinking that local and national identities disappear, but is about saying, people can very comfortably live with multiple identities and with multiple layers of belonging. Belonging is not one thing. It's not necessarily even stable. It's capable of being open-ended, capable of being a matter of choice, and capable of being multiple. Why do I say this? Because we have a thing called the Belfast Agreement, and that's what it does. What the Belfast Agreement did was it took two opposed fixed senses of belonging, classic, old-fashioned 19th century ideas of belonging, are you British or are you Irish, And it tried to place them in a dynamic relationship whereby they are no longer involved in a zero-sum game. Why did we be able to do this? Because we had to. We didn't evolve a sophisticated, dynamic sense of national belonging because we were better than the English or because we were better than anybody else. In fact, you could say we evolved worse because we had made all the mistakes. We know exactly what monolithic, fixed, zero-sum nationalism looks like. And we have evolved, and we're in a process of evolving, very painfully, I said very imperfectly, but nonetheless very radically, new ideas of what belonging means. Those ideas are summed up in that great sentence in the Belfast Agreement that it is the birthright of everyone in Northern Ireland to be Irish, or British, or both, as they may so choose. I think this is the most radical statement of belonging that's ever been placed to date in any international treaty. This is a legal document, not an aspirational piece of rhetoric. It's a legal document registered with the United Nations International Treaties, international law, and it states something very radical about belonging. Firstly, it says that belonging may be multiple or both. Secondly, it says that it's a matter of choice. And thirdly, the implication of it being a matter of choice is that it can change. It's not fixed. It's open. People can decide to be Irish today and British tomorrow and Muslim the next day. And indeed, we've seen people do this. So, the Irish border, which bedevils the Brexit process, is not just all of the incredibly complicated technical and political questions around the management of the border. It's also a border between two radically different ideas of belonging. We changed our constitution to say that our aspiration, our sense of national belonging, is no longer about territory. The Irish Constitution now says it took a classic 19th century definition of territory, of nationalism, which was territorial. It is our aim to reunite the national territory. And it says it is now our aim to reunite in harmony and friendship all of the people who share the territory in all of the diversity of their traditions and identities. We've come up with a very radical definition of what it is to belong to a nation. Frankly, I don't think we realised how radical it was when we voted on it in 1998. It's part of the peace process. It was nice. It was, who wasn't going to vote for it? The very fact that 95% of people voted for it suggests that we didn't really think about it that much. But it is, it is a milestone of which we should be very proud, and whose radicalism we should celebrate. And finally, it's also, I think, it has a lesson. There's something. If there's something positive to be gained out of this moment of Brexit, it is that the European engagement with the Irish question has been revivified. The European Union, unlike I would suggest the British government, has placed Ireland at the centre of this process, and has placed the Belfast Agreement at the centre of this process. And therefore, in a sense, the Belfast Agreement is acquiring a kind of European ownership, which was always to some extent there. Of course, the European Union was always both explicitly and implicitly an incredibly important factor in the creation of the agreement. But what's happening now is that, in a sense, that ownership is being taken. And if there's one positive thing that might come out of this car crash of Brexit, it is that perhaps the Belfast Agreement might also point forward a way for the European project to think about itself, which is that Europeans do not have to go from having one monolithic national identity to having a monolithic transnational identity. We are perfectly capable of living with multiple identities and of keeping those identities in a harmonious, dynamic and creative relationship with each other. I think we've found ourselves in a place in history on this island where we've had to learn. And I think it's out of this whole process of engagement with Ireland and Europe and Britain, it's perhaps one of the things that we can bring to European civilization, to European culture, to European project.
chairs if we ask him lots of questions in relation to what was an extremely interesting, very well thought through, and hopefully an essay of what's going to be in print when you get that publication out into there are lots of questions I think of, and as I said, I think we're going to need to deeper discussion debate, so that might have to wait for some time. Does anybody want to ask a question before we let him go?